How's that? Show up? Yep.
Good, Bobby.
Uh, those that are not in class, but they'll be wanting the recording. But we're going to talk about these philosophical things, the different ones, like I said, Neo-Pythagoreanism and also Neo-Platoism. And the idea of these is they're new in the sense that at one time that these were things that were taught, and then other things were taught, and so someone comes along and they bring it up again. But the ideas that are associated with Pythagoras and Plato enjoyed a resurgence, and that was during the first century AD. And so we have to remember that because, again, when we stop and think about the New Testament being written, because it takes, from actually, if we were to say 4 BC to 100 AD, that first century, the first 100 years after, well, including when Jesus came. And we need to know all we can know about what goes on at that time. And so the development that led to Neoplatonism had already been described briefly. We talked some about that last week. The Pythagorean school had ceased to exist by 300 BC. And so its first century revival taught many things, including a lot of the Platonic dualism and demonology that had been astounded by Pythagoras and himself. So he took over a number of the ideas and some of the literature from the Orphic cult. Both of these movements, they lacked organization. They didn't have schools, and the adherents taught wide ranges of ideas. In other words, they weren't consistent. Like if we were to stop for a moment and think about Calvinism, Calvinism is consistent in the sense that they started out with total depravity. If you start out with total depravity, you got to have some other things. Therefore, you had unconditional election, limited atonement, and irresistible grace, and then perseverance of the saints. Well, they didn't have any of that type of thing. In other words, they just simply taught different ideas. And so there came this interest in that of mathematics, and so the Platonic doctrines, doctrine of the forms, and reincarnation, taught by both Pythagoras and Plato, and was about all that linked them with the classical philosophers whose name they bore. Now, when we think about reincarnation, some people charge the Jehovah's Witnesses for believing in reincarnation, but it's not. They don't believe exactly that. Also, it's called transmigration. In other words, you die and then you come back. They don't believe it in that sense, but it's something similar. But they mix religion with metaphysics and astrology and advice for daily living to produce religious movements that presented themselves as an eclectic philosophies. And eclectic means that they took all the different philosophies and took out the parts that they liked. It's about like we have the New International Version is an eclectic version. That's what they did with that. And so Paul actually in Colossians chapter 2, we're going to look at a number of passages tonight. In Colossians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul, he writes to the church at Colossae, and we have to remember now, again, this is in the first century. We're talking around 63, when this was written, when Paul was in the Roman jail, that he writes, and he warns the Colossian church, against a combination of philosophy and vain deceit. He says there in Colossians 2:8, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit after traditions of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. So those were the philosophies. And so we're talking about this Neo-Pythagoreanism and also Neo-Platoism. That's what some of the things that's being taught at that time. And so because when you stop and we look at the Neo-Pythagorean teacher in New Testament times, we have a man by the name of Apollonius of Tyana, and he's actually he was credited with a miraculous birth. What we need to do is get in our mind how that Jesus came into the world and some things about the apostles, especially the Apostle Paul. But he was credited as with a miraculous birth, with the ability to exorcise demons, to heal the sick, and with a teaching ability that amazed even the Brahmas of India. Now, again, like I'm saying, is that you have to stop and think that this was during the first century, and Jesus has died, and therefore here comes someone kind of like our Lord. He traveled the Near East accompanied by some disciples of his, and the written account of his life is later than the Gospel in the book of Acts, and so the Gospels in the book of Acts. So we cannot be sure how much of the picture of Pollyanus is influenced by the stories about Jesus and Paul. But if you read those, you see kind of like the parallels, and which were relatively well known by AD 200. And suffice it to say that the traveling philosophers, gurus, was a familiar figure in the first century. And so Pliny, the elder, he records for us in reference to that an encounter with such a man, a Syrian. And in his letter, he serves to show us how eagerly people receive these itinerant teachers. And you'll notice in a minute, it's in the notes, but I'm going to read this. You'll notice that Pliny contrasts this man to the usual filthy, deliberately offensive cynics. And he says, and I quote, "If our city has ever supported humane studies, they are certainly flourishing there now." I could give many outstanding examples, but one will suffice. The philosopher Euphrates, just as only an artist had the ability to judge painting and sculpture and modeling, he says, so no one can understand a philosopher's excerpt except another philosopher. As much as I am able to judge, Euphrates had many exceptionally outstanding qualities which attract and edify even people who are only modestly educated. He argues subtly and profoundly in the eloquence, and he often displayed a truly Platonic richness and breadth of learning. He could speak at length on a variety of topics and had a particular charm which draws a reluctant audience and persuades them. In addition, he is tall and distinguished in appearance with long hair and a long white beard. His attributes are by his chance and may seem trivial, but he says they win a great deal of respect. There's nothing repulsive about his dress. His manner is austere without being gloomy, so that as soon as you meet him, you admire rather than shun him. The sanctity of his life is equaled only by his kindness. He attacks faults, not persons, and does not chastise wrongdoers, but corrects them. You will follow him as he taught, hanging on every word, and you would want him to continue persuading you after you've been persuaded. So that's what Pliny says about it. So one cannot help but think when you read about what he says there, that when you turn to Acts chapter 26 and verse 28, and here is Agrippa's reaction to what Paul said. If you read the whole thing that Paul is telling there, Agrippa, and we find that here comes Agrippa, and he says, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. In other words, that's the type of person that Paul was. And so this is the idea of Pollyanus that we see. Christian missionaries must have appeared to their pagan audiences as another variety of a traveling philosopher, and the message they brought was not entirely alien and containing elements central to the mystery cults and the philosophical schools of the day. I actually think sometimes when we look again at Acts chapter 17, is you stop and you think about them, and you look at the Apostle Paul when he goes into Athens, and everywhere he sees all these different statues or whatever it may be that's dedicated to a God, and all of a sudden he sees one there that says to the unknown God, and Paul says, well, that's the one I want to tell you about. I want to tell you about this God. And if you read the whole thing, what Paul tells them there, when he gets through, there's only one God. So those other things are not gods. And so he adapted, Paul did, a lot of some terminology to fit his needs. Matter of fact, in Acts chapter 17, he actually quotes some of the philosophers there. He quotes in Acts 17, 22 through 31, he quotes, if I can get this right, the Phaenomia of Artis, a poem popular in the Stoic circles of the time. He quotes him there, for we're the offsprings of God, and so on, and other things that are said there. So we have to understand that the more things we understand about the time, and it helps us to understand more about the Bible. And we find that out even in other studies, things outside the Bible, and especially When we start talking about science, well, the Bible is not a book of science, but there's science within the Bible. And therefore, we can look at those things, and those scientific facts known before they're ever discovered by man proves to us the existence of that of God. But it's not a science book. Not all Christians, though, welcome this cross-fertilization that went on between Christianity and the philosophical schools during the first century, though all of our sources on the matter are second century. A man by the name of Tertullian, and he is in the late second century, so he asked questions that became the battle cry for those who wanted to keep Christianity free from the Hellenistic condemnation or contamination. And so he would ask this question: what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? He wanted to propound a Christian theology totally devoid of that of cultural influences. Now you think about that. The majority of Christian thinkers, though, saw no reason to forfeit the Greco-Roman traditions in which they had reared and educated. And many of these people came to Christianity as adult converts and with many years of non-Christian worldview behind them. And so they saw a need for diplomatic relations, or at least a cultural exchange between that of Athens and that of Jerusalem. And so they assimilated the two by interpreting the teachers of the philosophical schools as early and imperfect versions of Christian doctrine. So that's what they would do to try to get people to be their followers or their students. They were aided in this process by the fact that certain terms used in the philosophical schools had been taken over by the church. Now, we noticed back in lesson number 5, the word heresy had originally meant a difference of opinion between the philosophers, but that's not how it's used in the Bible. Also, the word dogma had originated in the philosophical circles, as had the related term doxa, that is opinion. And if the philosophical schools were using terms familiar with that of Christians in a Christian context, and we're talking about God usually in the singular, it was easy for people without a sense of historical critical judgment to assume that they were talking about the same things as the philosophers. And so then you'll notice there that if that would have been the case, is when we look at Paul in Acts chapter 17 there, he said, I want to tell you about that God, one that's unknown there. And so he had gotten their attention, and even by using some of the things that they were used to hearing, he got their attention, and then he taught about the true God of heaven. So close was that association between Christianity and the philosophical schools that by the second century, some of those Christians were arguing that Christianity deserved to be legitimized, not as a religion, but as a philosophy. And the reason for they said that is because it met all the criteria to be a philosophy. So he had a founder with disciples, a group of disciples. They had a code of daily living. The Christians did, metaphysical, theological overtones. And so this argument was put forth by Justin Martyr. Now, Justin Martyr is also called Justin the philosopher. And I'm going to just stop from in my program, the Logos program that I have on my Bible, on my computer. They are actually have reprinted some of these historians, and we're able to buy them very cheap. And so I ordered some of them today. Maybe they'll go ahead and publish them, and I'll get them cheaper. But this Justin the philosopher, he says that he sought out first a Stoic teacher. And he then went to a peripatetic, a follower of Aristotle, who was interested above all in his feet. Then he also went to that of Pythagorean, and finally a Platonius, so that in a short time, he says, I believe that I had become wise. Such was my ignorance, he says. No. And so having found that all these schools are inadequate, we find that Justin Martyr, he turned to the true philosophy, that is Christianity. And he equates baptism to the moment of conversion to a philosophical school. He says, we call our washing enlightenment because those who learn these things have their minds enlightened. And so then you had another person by the name of Clement of Alexander. He summed up the Christian attitude toward philosophy as it had developed by AD 200. He says, my philosophy, I don't mean the Stoic or the Platonic school or the Epicurean or the Aristotelian, but whatever has been said correctly by any of the schools and whatever teaches righteousness along The wisdom, with wisdom combined with reverence, this elected body of learning is what I mean by philosophy. So he actually defined what he believed philosophy was. Now that ends that study in reference to, we're going to deal with that in the Greco-Roman philosophy. And so that ends there. Then that carries us to lesson number 7. It's called The Structures of Greco-Roman Society. And this is probably one of those lessons that would help us if we actually digest it and think about it as we study the Bible. Someone once complained that the historians give us the extraordinary events and omit just what we want, the everyday life of every particular time and country. And so the thing is when we look at the Bible, and also we're talking about, say for instance, the Samaritans. Well, I mean, what are we given? Not much in the book of Acts, chapter 8, which is simply that here where they go down to the Samaritans. There are other places, like we could go to the Kings, First Kings, and there I think it's chapter 15 and some other places, and we could find the Samaritans, find some things about their background. But yet from the standpoint of looking at the historians of the day or anything that has been written, has been found about Samaria, all of that would kind of help us with our understanding of Samaria and their way of life and what they did. And so that complaint is justified in our study of the New Testament. There's a great deal of scholarly discussion about Greek verb tenses and other such matters. And I'm one of those who likes the Greek language, and I like to study that. But on the other extreme, there is much preaching about the application of the message of the New Testament to modern life. And sometimes we forget the customs and the manners and the culture of the time. And I always like to try to use the example of that of the word wine. Wine back then was probably, the alcohol content was 13%. And they drunk that, and they mixed it with their water because they didn't have purified water like we have today. A lot of things change. And then you have someone comes along and says, well, there's nothing wrong in taking a drink of 100% alcohol wine. Well, because Jesus turned water to wine. Well, they don't understand the customs and the culture and the manners of the times. And therefore, we would find that how that wine was being used. It was medical, but also it was for that of drinking water. They mixed it in to help, purify it, as we would say, because of the alcohol content. But there are other extremes that people go. And so when we look at the Greek verb tense, or actually make the applications of the message of the New Testament to our modern life, those facets of the study of the New Testament are very important, but neither is a complete approach to the New Testament writings. And sometimes we get bogged down and when we're studying, and I think sometimes it's according to the congregation we go to. My first preaching places, I was small congregations where they needed a lot of help. And in one congregation, they all left the denominational world, and I was their first located preacher, and they needed a lot of help in a sense to come to a better understanding of what the New Testament taught. So we spent a lot of time on first principles, just explaining things. But a course like this would have helped them in many ways because they had learned about the customs and the manners and the culture of the people. So both, when we stop and look at the Greek tense verb approach or the application of the message, both of those examine the text in great detail, but too often they neither pay enough attention to the context. And then we talked about context in lesson number 1. You always have to look at the context, and that's what we would have to do if we were going to talk about wine. We look at the context in reference to John chapter 2. Both are generally enhanced by knowing something about how people live from day to day in the New Testament times, how they live. And sometimes, I preached on modesty from 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 9. And you have to stop and think for a moment, what is he saying in that passage in reference to modesty? And there are other passages that go along with that. And so you have to put all those passages together. We've examined some large issues when we, thus far in our study, in our class. We've talked about the power of government, the religious practices, and the intellectual outlook in reference to those philosophies and so forth. But in this lesson, we'll look at matters pertaining to social status and family life. And unfortunately, the New Testament writers didn't bother to fill us in on such things any more than a modern novelist stops to explain the functions of a mayor or a senator if one of his characters happens to be one. And so the audience for whom the book is written knows what those positions involve. Sometimes as preachers, and probably some of you who have taught Bible classes, you've gotten up and made a comment, and you understood what that word meant, but maybe somebody in class didn't. And we have someone at Cartersville that I had a privilege of baptizing he and his wife into Christ. And when he studied the Bible, he'd listened in Bible class, but he studied on his own. He kept a dictionary. And I told him one day, I said, Richard, you need to realize that you're reading Webster, and Webster is the 20th century dictionary that you have there, and you're not actually looking up the words from the Bible. But the thing was, it was giving him, he would go back and look at how far his dictionary would go back to tell what the word meant, so he would understand. And he did a great job in doing that. But the audience for whom the book is written knows what positions involve. So the original readers of the New Testament books, that is from Matthew, the book of Revelation, they had that kind of knowledge about the social classes and the living situations of their day. They didn't need a commentary like you and I do. I always tell people, they'll ask sometimes, you start to study with somebody and you say, well, what do you want to study? And they'll say the book of Revelation, Well, I don't have any problem with somebody studying the book of Revelation, but I tell you what I usually do when somebody asks me about studying the book of Revelation. I try to point out, I'll ask the first question I usually ask is, to whom was the book of Revelation written to? It was written to the 7 churches of Asia. So the 7 churches of Asia, when it was written, had to be in existence. If it was written to them, it had to be in existence, by all of them. And so that helps us to understand. And he tells us the condition of all 7 congregations. He gives us the good and the bad and the ugly, as we would probably say. So, they understood when John addressed them, they understood what was going on. Ovid says that there were poems written about how to play different types of ball games. Now, in my mind, this is how in the world could he have done that? Because, we think about ball, we think about how we play ball. I don't know how they play ball. But he wrote about that, how to swim, how to play with a hoop. No, I want that as a hula hoop. I don't know. But rules of dinner parties and other day-by-day matters. He wrote, they had books and stuff on that. This is the things that they did, but none of the books or none of those things that survived, because they weren't interesting to people who knew those things, and therefore they didn't see a need to make copies of them. Nor did they clutter their other works with explanation of things that they assumed that their readers would know. Some people, some of you ladies, you get a recipe, and sometimes you look at the recipe and they say, do something other there to it. And you look and say, well, I know how to do that, but, I as a man would not know how to do that unless I saw my mother or my wife do the very same thing. And so, but something, when my wife, sometimes she writes something down. My mother, one time, I called her before she passed away, and I said, Mom, I want to make some cornbread. Linda's not here, and I want some cornbread and milk. How do I do that? Well, she rattled that off to me. I said, you got to wait just a minute. I got to write this down. And I said, how do I mix it up? And she told me exactly how she made it. So I made me some cornbread, like my mother made. So I still have that piece of paper somewhere. But when you go to the book of Acts, in the book of Acts, in the American Standard Version, in chapter 19 and verse 31, and wait just a minute. There's a passage there that I just simply, I don't know how I missed that, but I did. I have gone over this thing about 3 times, but I've done it, and I missed Acts 19:31 right there. So in Acts chapter 19 and verse 31, now I'm going to read from the King James, but I'm going to tell you what the American Standard, if y'all don't have the American Standard, and Jim has the New King James, but in Acts chapter 19 and verse 31, it says, and certain of the chief of Asia. Now that chief of Asia, the American Standard says, the Asiarchs, Asiarchs, Asiarchs. And so he says there, the chief of the Asian, which were his friends, sent unto him, desiring that he would not adventure himself into the theater. So when the author refers to, as we would say, the Asiarchs, for example, he didn't have to stop and explain, well, let me tell you in a footnote what I actually mean by that. Well, when I was reading for our lesson and everything, and I came across the thing Asiarchs, I didn't know what it meant because I used the King James. Well, the King James tells you what it is. It's the chief of the rulers. That's what he says there in Acts chapter 19, verse 3, chiefs of Asia. And so that's who they were. And so we modern readers of that passage and many others must look to sources outside the New Testament for information. Now, if you were to look that up in the Greek language, that word, that phrase, that word right there, then it would most likely say Asia in there, or chief rulers. So we're going to examine some more of the formal aspects of social organizations within the New Testament. And then in the next lesson, we'll look at people's behavior and their relationship with one another. Now, Brother Ferguson in his book, and I'm going to tell you this now, we're on chapter 7 in the book that we're using, and that book only has 10 chapters, and we don't finish this class until sometime in May. I don't have my syllabus out, but sometimes in May. And so if we get through with this Exploring the New Testament World by Bale, I'm going to come back, and you can think about this, and it would help me to try to help you. If you have something that you, maybe that you would suggest that maybe we go back and look at a little deeper, because Brother Ferguson in his book goes into more depth than Mr. Bale does, and plus he being a brother in Christ, we can understand more of some of the things that he is saying. But he talks about the social class, and the society of the first century AD displayed a curious mixture of class consciousness and social mobility. Now, a vast gulf separated the wealthy from the poor. Now, basically what we see, in America in this 21st century, and especially because our economy, the way that it is, we've seen people that didn't have a job, got a job now. And they're making money. And you can see a difference in their outlook and their attitudes and things of that sort. And so we would look at our country and we would see from that is, I'm just going to use the word wealthy, to that of the poorest of all. We still see people that are standing on the side of the road saying that they're homeless and they need money for food and stuff like that. And so we still have those, but we don't see as many of those anymore. We don't in Cartersville. I know that. We used to have them down on every corner. That's not true now because there are jobs. And but in the New Testament times, you had, as we would say, the wealthy few and the poor masses. People were poor. Sometimes when I preach on giving, I use 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 9, and he talks about the people of that, as he writes to them, he talks about how really they were in poverty. He says poverty. That's why, but they gave anyway, even though they were in poverty. They had something to give, and they gave. So these people, you have the wealthy and you have the poor, and with only a relative handful of what we might call middle-class people. And those largely were in the provinces. And at the bottom of the social scale, as in any ancient society, were the slaves. We will examine that structure really from the top down. But in the Brother Ferguson's book, on page 55, if y'all see something flashing, that says light bulb up there. It's not lightning down here. He says on page 55, he says Roman society was stratified but not closed. Stratified but not closed. Military service, you like that, Jim? Among other things, made possible a certain upper social mobility, and the favor or disfavor of the emperor affected the standings of many families. Class or rank consciousness is very evident in the snobbery of the upper class, in the fallen difference shown by the lower orders. The aristocracy was composed of senatorial, equestrian orders. Ownership of land was the principal source of wealth and social standing. Nevertheless, the social class was not always the same as the social status. Wealth, education, and ability could confer status and influence apart from social class. And then he goes into a discussion of all those three different orders, the senatorial order, the equestrian order, and the municipal aristocrats. And he talks about them. And he also talks about some people we're going to bring up called the plebeians, and also the freemen, and also we're going to talk about that of slavery. And then we'll talk some more about Roman citizens. Well, he does that in that book. And we may come back to some of that because it deals with some of the Roman laws that maybe we overlooked or were not discussed earlier. But he examines that. So first in our book, though, he talks about the three classes. Now, from the earliest days of Rome, there have been two large classes of people. All right, the patricians, like the girl's name for name's Patricia. It's the patricians and the plebeians, 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 the way I said. The patricians were those whose ancestors had been in the Senate at the time of the Republic of Rome when it was formed in 509 BC. And so now just notice they were there. So anyone not born into that class was a plebeian. No matter how wealthy the plebeian might become or what office that he might hold, at first all office was reserved just for the patricians. But as a result of the pressure, now there was pressure brought on because, again, people multiplied. The plebeians, the right to hold office, they wanted to have the right to hold office and to marry into the patrician families. And so they gradually extended that to happen. So then the term came up, the nobles, not noble now, N-O-B-I, nobles, N-O-B-L-E, nobles, N-O-B-I-L-E-S, came to use to designate the plebeian born men who rose to hold high office and sit in the Senate. Now, by the time of Augustus, and this is in the first century, became emperor, there were legally three groups of Roman citizens. See, again, we don't get that. But in the descending order, you had the senatorial class, you had these equestrians, and then you had the plebeians. Now, wealth was the basis on which one could place himself into any of those classes. The magistrates, known as censors, they kept tabs on everybody's financial assets. So a total worth of 400,000 qualified an individual for entry into that of the equestrians. That's how much sesterces. That's S-E-S-T-E-R-C-E-S. That's the way they counted their money. You had to have 400,000 of those. And so the so-called, they were called this because in Rome's early days, they were plebeians, wealthy enough to own a horse and ride into battle. Now, membership into this senatorial class required 1 million of those sesterces. The censors didn't care where the money came from. Okay? So Pliny simply gave one of his friends 300,000 of those to qualify him to be for the equestrian class. A character in one of Martell's epigrams has less luck begging on an old friend for a loan of 100,000 of them to bring him up to the minimum. So the number of people in these top two classes was quite small. One scholar estimated that there was no more than 0.02% of the empire's population were the senatorial rank. Now, again, remember that if you studied Julius Caesar, you remember about the Senate and so forth and all that type of thing that went on. So while the equestrians total less than 0.1%, now think about that, we said 0.002%, and then the other one less than 0.1%. These were privileged classes in every sense of the word. They sat in the front rows in the theaters and the arenas. Now, stop just for a moment. When you turn to when you turn to James chapter 2, somebody comes in with a better clothing on. Now, think about that. Now, here it is. James writes about some types of here because these people were privileged. And James is trying to get across in the book of James. He's trying to get this across to them. He's trying to say, look, you can't show partiality, no matter whether the person's wealthy or a person rich. And you say the rich people come in all this nice clothing, and you're going to put them on the front row. And you're going to put the person who comes in with bad clothing on the back row. He says, you can't do that. Well, here it is. These privileged class people, that's what happened to them. They sit on the front rows in the theaters and the arenas. So when they came to quote to the services, they thought they have the same freedom to do so. Members thought, well, that's what they need to do is put these people up here. They were entitled to wear a purple stripe on their clothing. broad for the senators and narrow for the equestrian. Now, I have a purple tie, but it's red. I got a red one on today. But this purple, it was actually closer to scarlet, to our scarlet. This purple dye, remember Acts chapter 16? Lydia was a seller of purple, was expensive because of the difficulty of extracting it from that of the seashells. But she was a seller of that. Now, if she was a seller of that and it's expensive, she was a wealthy person. The loss of these ranks was a serious blow in a society where one of the dignities mattered almost as much as life itself. Marshall himself promoted to the equestrian class by the Emperor Domitian. He ridiculed men who tried to retain their seats in the equestrian section of a theater after they had been demoted from that order. In other words, you could be demoted. Because again, you had to keep up that, whatever it was, 400,000, 100,000, or whatever it may have been. The fact that he devoted 5 poems to the subject suggests that it was an important topic for his audience. So Paul seems to be suggesting, if you turn over to 2 Corinthians in your Bible, I'm going to read that in just a few moments. He seems to be suggesting that in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, that such concerns with social status needs to be set aside. Let's go over there, 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And let's just read 17 verses. Now, think about what we just said in reference to the audience and so forth, and what was important in their social status. Now, Paul writes me, he says, now I beseech you. Now, again, remember that the congregation is made up of Jews and Gentiles. He says, now, I, Paul, myself beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base among you, but being absent am bold toward you. But I beseech you that I may not be bold when I am present with that confidence wherewith I think to be bold against some which think of us as we walk according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of the strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. And having a readiness to revenge all disobedience with your obedience is fulfilled. Do you look on things after the outward appearance? If a man trusts to himself that he is Christ, let him of himself think this again, that as he is Christ, even so are we Christ. He says, for though I should boast somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us for edification and not for your destruction, I should not be ashamed. That I may not seem, if I would terrify you by letters, for his letters say they are weighty and powerful, but this his body presence is weak and his speech contemptible. Let such a one think this, that such as we are in word by letters, when we are absent, such will we be also deep when we are present. For we dare not to make ourselves of the number or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves, but they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves among themselves are not wise. Now you get the point that he's making there. He says, but we will not boast of things without our measure, but according to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed to us, a measure to reach each unto you. For we stretch not ourselves beyond our measure, as though we reach not unto you. For we are come as far as you, according as also in preaching of the gospel of Christ. Not boasting of things without measure, that is, of other man's labors, but having hope, when your faith is increased, that you shall be enlarged by you according to your rule abundantly, to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's line of things make ready to our hand. But he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. For not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth. So you can see the idea there. He says, we're not measuring ourselves by everybody else. And so the idea, he's telling them that this social idea, you need to set all that aside. And again, James does the very same thing in James chapter 2. In spite of what may appear to be a rigid class system, it was possible for a hard-working, unscrupulous person to make his way to the social ladder. Now, I can remember, people wanted to climb the social ladder back in the 60s and the 70s and 80s, and even today, people want to go higher and higher. We hear people talk about their parents and how their parents struggled, and especially like during World War too. And when they came out, and how they were people who pinched pennies and saved money. And so when they got older and got, right now we don't have a lot of people from that area living, but most of them, had a pretty good income, good savings, because they held on to some of those things. But in another poem addressed to the free man, which we'll talk about, named Callistratus, Marshall points out that he himself is a famous writer because of his talent, while Callistratus is inordinately wealthy. And he says, you can't be what I am, but any one of the common people can be what you are. So this ability of lower class people to rise to the equestrian order and the order's prominence in business and civil service may have contributed to the spread of Christianity across that of social boundaries. We would find that Apulus, he wrote this, and I'm going to read this. He says, protecting the consumer in ancient Rome. Leaving the marketplace, Lucius ran into Python, whom he had not seen in several years, and they exchanged greetings. Python said, I am in charge of the grain supply and am edible. If you want anything, I'll be happy to help you. You're very kind, Lucius says, but I've already purchased some fish for my dinner. Pythus, when he saw the basket, shook it so that he could inspect the fish more carefully. What did you pay for this garbage? He says, I was finally able to bargain the fishmonger down to 20 dinars, Lucius replied. When he heard that, Pythus grabbed Lucius by the arm and dragged him back into the marketplace. For which one of these thieves did you buy these scraps? Lucius pointed at an old man sitting in the corner of the market. With all the authority of his office, Pythus immediately began to be rating the old fellow in a very harsh tone of voice. Is this how you treat visitors to our city, especially a friend of mine? How dare you charge 20 denarii for these wretched little minnows, he says. Jim, you don't do that, do you, with them fish you catch? We used to give them away when we caught them, and people always want to know if we cleaned them yet. It says, if you drive food prices up like that, no one will be able to afford to live here. And our fair city will be deserted. You're not going to get off with just a warning either. He then dumped Lucius' fish on the ground and ordered one of his servants to trample them. Satisfied with the way he had fulfilled his duties, he turned to Lucius. You can go along home now, he says. I think the old scoundrel has been sufficiently punished. Now, who did he actually punish? He actually punished Lucius because the old Lucius don't have anything to eat now. So the Romans relied on tribute from the provinces. They levied no income tax on the citizens. There was little, if any, government regulations of business practices, and beyond providing supervisors of the marketplace there, whose jobs were to ensure fair weights and measurements. In our archaeology class, we have a picture where they have found 10 little weights that they use, and everybody would have those. They'd all be supposed to be the same, if they had one that was 1 ounce, everybody had 1 ounce, and so on. They had 10 of those. And it was his job to ensure fair weights and measurement and protect also against the outrageous form of price gouging. And so Apulus, he brought about the activities of such a magistrate, free of taxes and closed regulations. An individual could acquire vast wealth in a short time. So slaves who were emancipated often used their contacts with their former master's friends and business associates to enrich themselves. So Pliny described a man named Macedo, a member of the Senate and a former public magistrate, who was a haughty and cruel master who retained little memory, or perhaps too keen a memory, of his own father's status as a slave. Then there was Trimachio in Petrontius' writing that he wrote, called Satyricon, was a freed slave who became so rich that he counts his own slaves in battalions and throws out a silver dish which a slave dropped. So while most Romans were eager to take advantage of all this mobility, some aristocrats, like Pliny, felt it was important to preserve distinctions between the classes. And Juvenal, another historian, and others also echoed this snobbery, as we would call it. So in the provinces, the wealthier people were called decurions, and they made up the council which had oversight of the local matters and the collection of taxes. So if the province was unable to supply the tax burden assigned to it by Rome, the decurions had to make up the difference out of their own personal wealth. Now the Asiarchs, those chief rulers who were friends of Paul, Acts chapter 19, verse 31, were members of this class. Now they were his friends. Remember that Paul, being, he was a Pharisee at one time. So although they were wealthy by local standards, property qualifications for decurions were about a tenth of those for senators and the Christians in Rome. And the percentage of those who held such status in each province was not much higher than the percentage of the equestrians in the population at large. And so inscriptions reveal that some of the persons honored for civic benefactions who had to be quite wealthy to make such donations were Christians. And so the group most conspicuous by its near absence from Greco-Roman society is a middle class of tradesmen and shopkeepers. There was wasn't hardly many of those. And so the growth of such a class was checked by the nobility reliance on slavery and the tendency of the lower class to be content with handouts from the rich and fairly low standards of living. So the upper class did not need to hire free laborers to go or to go to shops to buy goods. Much of what they consumed was produced on their estates. Services were provided by their numerous slaves and their clients and their tenant farmers. And so a certain time, nobility or other special occasions, day laborers had to be hired. Now let's go over to Matthew chapter 20. A familiar story. As a preacher, we preach on this. And Matthew chapter 20, begin in verse 1. Matthew 20, verse 1. He says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a man that is a householder." Now, we just talked about, to stop for one thing, that here they were, at certain times, these notable harvests or other special occasions, these day laborers would be hired. Now, notice I said earlier, here they were, they got all their stuff from their own estate, and they had numerous slaves, they had clients, they had tenant farmers. So here it is, he says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a man that is a householder." So he takes us to that, to the social issues. He says, "Which went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said unto them, Go you also in the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you. And they went their way. And he went about the 6th hour and 9th hour and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing around and said to them, Why stand you here all day idle? They say unto him, Because no man hath hired us. He says unto them, You go also in the vineyard, and whatsoever is right, that shall you receive. So when eve was come, the Lord of the vineyard said unto the steward, Call the laborers and give them their hire, beginning from the last to the first. And when they came, they that were hired about the 11th hour, they received every man a penny. Now, but when the first came, and they supposed that they should receive more, and they likewise received every man a penny, and when they had received it, they murmured against the goodman of the house. So here's this employment, and it had to be, as we would say, sometimes it was there, and sometimes it wasn't. They were day laborers, and so they had to be hired. So their employment was, was on and off, and plus it was low paid. Now I recall when I came back from the military in got out in '69, and I eventually, somewhere around 70, latter part of 70, I went to work for a furniture store there in Cartersville as a collector. Then I became a credit manager and then office manager of that. But right across the street from us there, right there on the square, down where the depot was, there would be people that gathered there every day. And the people would come by and he'd say, I need 6 men. And 6 people would jump on the truck. Now, if those 6 men weren't real good, the next day, if he's going to tell them, he would tell them to meet him somewhere. Because he wanted the same 6 men because they weren't real good. And so that's basically what they were doing. So this does not mean that craftsmen and shopkeepers did not exist. They had some of those, they had to. But in the large cities, they certainly did exist, and so they achieved some kind of economic security or social respectability possible in those positions. Manual labor, though, was disdained by the aristocratic Greeks and Romans and by those who pretentious to that group of people. I always think about, when I think about that, I always think about Gone with the Wind. You remember that, Gone with the Wind? Scarlett O'Hara, you know, here she was, and she had to get out there and get the crops in. I think it was cotton and so forth. She worked with the slaves and so on, so they wouldn't lose everything. Well, you know, the people berated her because of that, and that's the way it was back then. People, that was laborers' work, and so laborers had to do it. So those people who owned all of that, they didn't do any of that work. So it was something that slaves and women would do. Theorizing about scientific principle was a gentle and intellectual exercise. Inventing something was for the mechanics. Someone like Archimedes, who put his ideas to work, was rare, but Paul took some risk in terms of social status by he was a tent maker. Now, you go back and look at Paul. I mean, you know, he's a Pharisee and everything that he had, and he went to school, and as we would say, he knew more about the law than even his teachers knew. And yet we would find that he did that. Now, there are a couple of passages, like 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 12, when Paul writes to the Corinthian brethren. He makes this statement. He says, and labor working with our own hands, being reviled, we bless, being persecuted, we suffer. So Paul worked. He didn't see any problem with that of working. Also, 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 9. But perhaps that's why he wanted his preaching to support him, but more likely he wanted the extra free time to proclaim the gospel. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 14. If people supported him, he had more time to preach and teach the gospel of Christ. And this is something that it always bothers me. And when people ask me, I tell them how I feel about things. I think we ought to do that every once in a while. But what bothers me is you got someone that's, some of you may know missionaries, some missionaries in different places. And here they are, they're over there working, wherever they may be working. And I remember, and a good friend of mine, I went to Memphis School of Preaching with him, went to graduate school with him, that's Barry Hatcher. And Brother Hatcher, he was over in Indonesia. He'll start to work there. He'll start a school of preaching there that's self-supported now. The congregation they helped start, they're self-supported and supporting preachers in that area. In other words, they started on the ground and built up, and they taught them how to actually do the work themselves and support themselves. And yet he would have to leave that work and come back to the States and raise money because some congregations would quit giving to his work. In other words, they said, we'll help you for 5 years. Well, did he succeed in 5 years to make himself self-supporting over there? Well, the answer was no. But look, he started the school, and the school was getting self-supporting, and the congregation where he was working was self-supporting, but he still had to be supported. And so he got to support, stayed there for some time. Then he came home and stayed here in America and preached in America. And then it was time for him to go back over there. And we at Cartersville, he called and wanted to know if we'd support him. He says, I know. And I said, well, Barry, how much do you need? He said, well, this is what I'm, just trying to get support. And I told him, I said, well, he says, I'll come by. I said, Barry, you don't have to come by here. I'll tell the elders that you're wanting some support, and I'll let you know what they say. And so I told the elders, and they said, well, then we'll give him so much amount every month. So I called him. He said, well, let me come by that time. I said, Barry, if you know of any other place that you need to go to raise money, you go. You got the money here. Because, he was a good worker, and we all loved him and know the type of work that he did. But missionaries have to leave their areas of work sometimes and come back. Well, Paul made tents, so he wouldn't have to do that when he needed to, but he'd rather, according to 1 Corinthians 9:14, be able to proclaim the gospel without having to do that. Now, we would have that the Roman senators were forbidden by law to engage in business. Most dodged the restriction by having their slaves and freemen run their enterprise. Okay? The only socially acceptable way to earn money was to own land, which could be farmed or rented. And plus, you have to realize if you own land, there's just so much land. Investment in overseas trade was not considered too disruptible as long as the senator did not conduct business himself, and as long as he had a lot of money at it. Marriage and inheritance were the preferred ways to pass large sums of money around in Rome. So these attitudes produced a society which one scholar described as having a top at the top, the quite minute but extraordinary, prominent and rich nobility, and at the bottom a last mass of totally indigent, strung out between the extremes, a variety of heard of genus to be called in any sense a middle class, and then there was those in between those
But
extremes.
they
So,
I was looking at some.
I'm sorry.
Figured or something.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay,
Nothing.
I thought you was asking me something. Another scholar had calculated that by the first century BC, should be AD, the income of a moderate wealthy person would have been several hundred times as great as that of a poor person, and the income of an extremely wealthy person would have been over 17,000 times that of a poor person. Now, you look at that disparity between the rich and the poor, and that had to create resentment, and it did, and it's reflected in that of the New Testament. The poor in the Roman Empire survived by crowding into small apartments, taking advantage of free water available in fountains all over town, and receiving a subsistence allowance of grain from the government, maintaining the grain supply, and that shows the shows which distracted the populace became a cornerstone imperial policy. The lower class almost certainly suffered from various kinds of dietary problems. Beggars were everywhere, but they're not mentioned in literature, but perhaps because of things going on and people trying to do this type of work and that type of work, either individual or corporate was not part of the Greco-Roman social conscience, as we've already pointed out. So the Romans instituted a system to support orphans only in the early 2nd century. Not even among non-Christian Jews is there clear evidence of an organized charity before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 7. Despite of all that prophetic cries for justice to the poor and the high value placed upon that of almsgiving, the Jewish Talmud describes the collection of distribution of money and food for the poor, but the practice may have started in imitation of that of the Christians. So we would find that in general, the Greeks and the Romans felt no responsibility or no sympathy for the poor. In the 2nd century, Polybius summed up the Roman attitude this way. He said, "No Roman willingly gives anything to anyone." So the poverty of the poor people was considered to be the will of the gods or the results of their own folly. And Juvenal, he put it this way. He says, "What is worse than the mere fact of being poor is that it makes people the object of ridicule." Most of the Romans would have agreed with Jesus that the poor will always be with us, Matthew 26, verse 11, but they would have missed the poignancy of his observation and his deep-seated concern for the downtrodden. The suffering among this class of people went largely unrecorded, but was nonetheless, it was real. There were those who were downtrodden, suffered, and so on. Okay, it is 7:31, so we take a 10-minute break. And we'll be back, and we'll talk about the patriots and the clients. I gotta get me something to drink. Whew. Okay, y'all got back? I'm back. Uh, okay. Also, in our book, in Brother Ferguson's book, he deals with the patrons and the clients. And again, we have to understand those words and how they're used. There is a recent study has emphasized the importance of the patronage in Roman society. He says it is actually a reciprocal relationship in which both the patron and the client had duties to each other. It was a personal and not a business or commercial relationship existed between parties of different status and was a voluntary, not a legal relationship that could be initiated by either party, but the social conventions were stronger than any regulation of law. A regular code of etiquette governed the duty of a client to the patron. The client appeared daily at early morning at the house of the patron to offer salutations and requests. The client was responsible for assisting the patron in political and private life and for showing respect by walking in the funeral procession. The patron's importance was gauged by the number who attended the morning audience, since a status symbol was the number of clients attending a person. There was an incentive to free slaves who, as freemen, became one's clients. The patron's role was to give a small dole of gifts or money. The patron rendered assistance in need, welcomed the client from time to time to his house and table, and offered legal protection as needed. The relationship operated on all the levels in the various groupings between former masters and freemen, rich and poor, generals and conquered people, aristocrats and clubs, and everyone from slaves to aristocrats felt bound to display respect to someone more powerful than himself, up to the emperor. So in addition to social relationship, there was a literary patronage, support of the author of the wealthy person, the political, and also economical. And so different ones. He says here, Phoebe, the servant of the church at Cenchrea, is described as a patroness, Romans 16:2, one who gives aid and who has the resources to do so. So actually, no society could survive for long with such vast, obvious inequities. The Romans had no fault of the government interventions to redistribute the wealth. They contrived a system whereby enough money trickled down from the top to keep the lower classes people pacified, not satisfied, but pacified. Each wealthy man was expected to act as his patron, as I said, protector to as many lower class people as he could reasonably support. And so in the early days of the Roman Republic, this assistance took the form of legal help and financial assistance during illness or when a dowry was needed to marry off a daughter. In return, the client supported his patron in elections, did odd jobs for him, and escorted him through the streets, giving the patron's social standing as a healthy boost. So by the imperial times, the electoral support was no longer an issue since elections took place in the Senate. And so the patron-client system had become hereditary, though, and patrons continued to support clients as a measure of their status. Some nobles supported entire towns, we're told. And so the client was expected to provide noisy support for his patron whenever the latter went to court. Court cases, they were usually heard outside, and since secret ballots were not commonly used in the courts, the jury could be swayed by, here's this person making all this racket in the audience. And so anyone who could afford a client or two considered it an investment when it comes to that. So even slaves in wealthy households are known to have had clients who hoped that the slave would use his influence with his owner to secure favors for the client. And so here's these relationships that they had, and yet the relationship functioned as an informal welfare system, but it's also reinforced the low opinion in which labor was held. Now, an able-bodied man needed not work as long as he had a patron. Each day he received from his patron a small sum of money for his daily expenses. And so on birthdays and other special occasions, he could anticipate a gift. Now, Marshall, he complains in some of his poems that his patron had been stingy with such gifts, and he seems to regard them as a right. And so we see in Marshall's poems that that a client had little time to work because he was expected to attend his patron on his trips around town and even carrying his sedan chair through the muddy streets. And so this fundamental feature of Roman society seemed to underlie several passages of the New Testament. And so if we stop and now talk about slaves, on page 59 through 61 of our Brother Ferguson, he deals with the slavery aspect. He says that slavery was a basic element in ancient society. Much of the initiative, as well as the work done, belonged to this class. Slavery was very extensive in both the Hellenistic and Roman periods, as the large number of prisoners of war made slaves cheap in Hellenistic Greece and Republican Rome. However, the stable conditions of the early empire made homebred slaves the main source of supply and expensive procedure. Nonetheless, it is estimated that 1 in 5 of the residents in Rome was a slave. So a proposal in the Senate that slaves be required to wear a distinctive dress was defeated, lest the slaves learn how numerous they were. You stop and think about that. So it makes you stop and think about the Egyptians looking at all the Jewish people and say, oh, so these people, they could be more of them than there are us. And so, because there was a distinction that was made. Well, he goes on and talks more about that. And again, like I said, at the end of our time, we finish our book, we may come back and look at some of that. But the slaves were at the bottom of the social scale. Now, slaves were numerous, and they were an important part of New Testament times in the society. Roman slavery, however, differed in one way from the institution which existed in America South before the Civil War. In Rome, in the Romans' times, slaves and masters were of the same ethnical background and thus indistinguishable from one another. Seneca records that a proposal was put forth as a step that they wear this distinctive clothing. So that's what they wanted. But they pointed this out. Well, they'll see how how many there are of them, and so in comparison to the free population, and so they stopped it right quick. But emancipation, which was common, conferred citizenship, but even freed slaves continued to have obligations to their former master. Now, they're free, but they have some obligations, and who became their patrons. In some ways, a man was better off as a slave, since the free man had no one but himself and his family to care for if he was sick or injured. Now, a slave owner had money invested in his slaves and saw to it that they had medical care and sufficient food and sufficient housing. A free man could take none of those things for granted. And so how the slaves were treated in the first century varied with the individual master. Now, I understand, my understanding of what I know about our country, that the same was true. And I learned a lot after I became a member of the church, that there were a lot of members of the church who had slaves during that time, and they were treated very well. And matter of fact, many of them are already sharecroppers in Tennessee and in Texas and some other places. But Pliny claims to treat his slaves humanely, never working them in chains, allowed them to make wills, sending one to a friend's villa on the French Riviera to recuperate from an illness. Pliny was probably an exception to the rule, but Seneca criticized the typical Roman masters as thoughtless and cruel in his treatment of his slaves. And so other writers supported that charge also, and so describes that the aristocratic women striking a slave girl who had not arranged her mistress' hair to suit her, and the man who cut off a slave's tongue and crucified. So you had Juvenal. He also comments on the upper class women who take out their anger at their husbands by beating their slave. Now the problem was common enough that the city of Athens provided a place of refuge where slaves could escape brutal treatment, though not slavery itself. The Emperor Claudius passed laws limiting the master's right to punish or kill slaves, but in the law, the slave always remained a piece of property. Now, you stop for a moment and you think about what we learn in in the New Testament in reference to that. That Paul says, that basically masters are to treat their slaves like Christians, and slaves are to treat their masters as Christians, and therefore they are supposed to look at that with one another. that they were supposed to, the master was supposed to be the best master, and the slave was supposed to be the best slave as a Christian. And so we are given a lot of things about, in reference to that. And today we make the application to employee and employer. But by the middle of the first century, Stoic philosophy was widespread enough to bring about some improvement in some of these conditions for the slaves, because its view was that all persons are subject to fate and not responsible for their social status. Now, Seneca professed to see no difference between the slave and the free person except an accident of birth or political misfortune. Now, the Apostle Paul, when he was writing to the churches of Galatia, in Galatians 3 and verse 28, if you recall, he says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. And that's what they're supposed to look at. But anyone who became a slave, if his country was conquered by another, he would become that slave. There is thus, as we would stop and think about it, no inborn inferiority. I'm trying to do something here to this manuscript. Anyone becoming a slave of his country was conquered by another, so there was no inborn inferiority in a slave. Aristotle, by contrast, he taught this. He said that some ethnic groups were by nature suited to be slaves. Now, Seneca claimed to allow his slaves to eat dinner with him as equals and discuss important topics with him. And even under the influence of Stoicism and later of Christianity, the Romans gradually came to acknowledge the humaneness of their slaves. And Christians did not advocate the abolition of slavery, such as the notion would have been the equivalent of someone today campaigning for the prohibition of automobiles. And so slaves were such an essential, fundamental part of society that no one of that day could have stood far enough outside the social circle to talk about doing away with the institution of slavery. So what Christians did, they called for an enlightenment attitude toward that of slaves as fellow human beings, and that they be treated that way. So when we read the New Testament, we find that actually to be the case, that even the New Testament helps us to understand that we're all human beings, and as the passage says, we're all one in Christ, especially when we talk about that of Christians. And yet, if we were to stop for a moment and we were to think, say, I'm a Christian, and I lived back to that time, I'm a Christian, but my slaves were not. If I had those slaves working with me, they were not Christians, I was supposed to be the best master around. I was to be a light to them. Now, if they were Christians and I wasn't a Christian, then they were supposed to be the best slaves they could be, so that I could see, no matter what I did or what I saw that was being done to others, that they did the best thing they could do as that of human beings, and they were human beings just like me. And so that's what he would mean, is that for you're all one. Now, we're all one, yes, in Christ as Christians, but we're still all one. We're all made by God. We're all made in the image of God. But slaves were treated, however they were treated, they could, once freed, blend into the surroundings in a way that black folks were never able to do in the South. And so Pliny's friend Macedo, I think is the way they really say that, had been able to rise to the pinnacle of the Roman society from humble beginnings, achieving both wealth and status. And Roman law provided that any child born to a slave after emancipation was a free person without any legal stigma deriving from his father's former servitude. And here's the poet Horace. He was a son of a free man, became a close friend to the Emperor Augustus. The free slave himself, though barred from holding office or advancing into the upper parts of society, could achieve whatever financial success he was capable on his own in his lifetime. If he lived long enough, he might see his children gain social respectability to complement their wealth. By the mid-first century BC, even AD, even the restrictions against free men holding positions of power were crumbling, especially if the emperor were interested in advancing in an individual career, as Claudius did with that of his freedom of Antonius Felix. And so we can see some parallels to our own country in some of that, and probably some not as good as back then, or maybe some better than back then. The freed slave continued to have obligations to his former masters, now his patron, and so in some cases this free person would still live in the master's house, especially if his wife was still a slave. A free man might have nowhere else to go and few resources to fall back. Little could change about his life except his legal status. So in two letters that merit comparison with Paul's letters to Philemon, Pliny pleads with a friend to receive back into his fellowship a free man who had offended his patron in some way. He writes, he says, you did well to take back into your heart, and kind of think about Philemon. If you haven't read Philemon, you need to go over and read Philemon. He says, if you do well to take back into your heart and your home the free man who once was dear to you, as I asked you to do in my letter. You'll be glad you did. I certainly am. First, because I see you're so ready to listen to advice and that you can be in control of yourselves even with anger, when angry, and then because you have paid me such a great tribute by yielding to my authority or granting my request. And so I commend you and offer you thanks. And remember now, Pliny was a wealthy person. At the time, he says, I caution you that in future you stand ready to forgive the faults of your people, even if there's no one like me around to intercede for me. And so again, he was trying to get him to take him back, just like we would do as we would read the book of Philemon there, and how that was handled by the Apostle Paul when he wrote Philemon. Now, again, my understanding when I read Restoration history and stuff like that, that there were members of the church and their slaves had become members of the church, and they had that type of relationship. And some of them were not members of the church, but they had already become sharecroppers. They were actually, being paid very well in reference to here's the person who owned everything and provided everything, and they were 50-50 partners, so to speak, 60-40 or something like that. But in some places, they were paid very well, and but in some places they weren't, and so. That's the history that we have, and so we don't like to read about those things, but again, that's the history. Now, we hear a lot about women. And so in Rome, well, let me go to brother here first. Ferguson. Brother Ferguson on page 77 through 88, he uses 12 pages to talk about this, and I got to change something. I put down page 97, and it's page 197. So, okay. And he talks about this, and I'm just going to read a little bit what he says. He says, all of the picture of classical Greek women kept in seclusion has been overdrawn. Their sphere was definitely the home. The degree of their confinement resulted from the importance of not allowing any suspicion to fall on young girls or wives in order to protect the legitimacy of children. A separate part of the house was designated the women's quarters and was off limits to others. Women managed the household, and in that sphere they were supreme. The description of the place of women in the pastoral epistles very closely Greek conception, 1 Timothy 5:14, Titus 2:3-5. In an oft-quoted statement, Apollodorus, middle 4th century, described the situation. We have courtesans, that is for pleasure, handmaidens for the day-to-day care of the body, wives to bear legitimate children, and to be a trusted guardian of things in the home. Now, he talks about a lot more things in there also, but that gives us the idea. In Rome at the time, it remained true, as always in antiquity, that women did not count for much. Quite literally, they didn't count for much. They were not included in the census figures, nor even in the New Testament writers were enlightened enough to count them. When describing the feeding of 5,000, it concludes this way. It says those who ate were about 5,000 men besides women and children. Roman women did not even bear individual names. As with Julia from Julius, if a man had more than one daughter, the second would be designated Secuta, the third Tirtai, and so on. So they might be designated as major and minor, the elder and the younger. And so under the empire, that is the Roman Empire, women, they enjoyed greater social freedom than at any other time before and since until this century. Now, many women ran businesses, and as we said, remember Lydia, left to them when their husbands died. They bought and sold property on their own, though this was not strictly legal until the Emperor Claudius' reign. Remained single because there was no particular pressure on them to marry, and in general live what could be called a liberated life. And we noted that in lesson 4, that women could even obtain Roman citizenship, although it did not allow them to vote or hold office, but they become citizens. But as Michael Grant, this Michael Grant is someone who does a lot of studies on Roman history. He observed, though women could not hold office, they were traditionally influential. And the early empire produced some terrifying autocrats and termocrats. And so women figured prominently in the social life of Rome. They enjoyed freedom of movement, socializing, which was denied them in the other ancient societies, and it's particularly in that of Greece. Greek men considered women by nature intellectually inferior to men. The primary level of interaction between them was sexual. And so Greek women of the citizen class were typically excluded from social functions. And Roman men shared the Greeks' opinions to a degree. So women never enjoyed political rights in Rome, but their opportunities for education and social activities were greater in Rome than they were in Greece. Now, think about all of that, okay? Then think about the church. The churches consisted of people that were Hellenistic Jews, Judean Jews, and Greeks, okay? And they were all together. They became in the church, and there were some problems. And we find that we deal with those problems. Paul deals with that in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and other passages. 1 Corinthians 14 about women speaking out during the worship service and things of that sort, and some other places that they deal with that. But just think about all this going together. Some religious cults, such as the Dionysus and the Monodia, were primarily and exclusively for women. Their rituals allowed the women as an opportunity to be out from under the domination of that men for a few days. Notice I said for a few days, they said. But the Greco-Roman women lived under the protection of their fathers until they were handed over to their husbands. Now, if the husband and father both died, the closest male relative became the woman's guardian. Now, you remember the Sadducees? They're Sadducees. The Sadducees, how they questioned Jesus about, whose wife she going to be, and so on. Pharisees, I said Sadducees, Pharisees. So throughout their lives, they had the legal status of children. In Cicero's words, he says, our ancestors made it a rule that women, because of their weak intellects, should have guardians to take care of them. And so that may have been the legal situation, but in actual fact, Roman women were educated. They ate and conversed with their husbands and with guests, and often ran family businesses when their husbands were unable to do so. Now, Cicero's wife had properties, including an apartment building, which were part of her dowry. In addition, she managed her husband's financial affairs, which he was when he was in exile. Ovid pays frequent and lengthy tribute to the way his wife handled their affairs and kept pressing his case for recall when he was exiled. And so in spite of women's apparent liberation, we need to be reminded that men of the first century never ceased to regard them as second-class citizens, always in need of education, toleration, and always defined in a relation to a man, preferably that of a husband. And so the considered differences in age that typically exist between husband and wife help foster such attitudes as finally displays. For a man in the first century, marrying a wife was more like adopting a daughter. Now, this is Pliny's idea of an ideal wife. The ideal wife, he says, my wife has the greatest intelligence and just as great skill at running the house. She loves me, which is an indication of her purity. To these qualities, she adds a love of literature, which arises from her love of me. She keeps copies of my writings at hand and even memorizes them. When I am arguing a case in court, she is anxious until she learns the verdict. She arranges for messengers to tell her what sort of reception I got and whether I won the case. I read one of my compositions. She sits nearby, shielded by a curtain, and eagerly drinks in my applause. She sets my poetry to music and sings it, accompanying herself on the lyre. Her only teacher is love, the best of all masters. For this, For these reasons, I have the most certain hope that our harmony will increase each day and will last forever. For she does not love me for my age or physical appearance, which would be slowly changed, but by my fame. That's what he said. So the list of noteworthy Roman women is very long, from Lucretia, who inspired the overthrow of Roman's last king, to Cornelia, mother of Gracchus brothers, the reformers of the late republic, and on to the women of the imperial family, most notably Olivia and the two Agrippians. Nor should one forget Domitia, that is the Emperor Domitian's cousin, who may have been a Christian, they say, and who was sent into exile with her husband when her husband was executed. Pliny also talks about a number of women that he admired for their brave deeds and inspiring words. And we should also recall that there are two nameless deaconesses whom Pliny tortured to give information about Christians in Bithynia, we talked about in lesson 4. There must have been large numbers of women who played active roles in the Roman society at that time, and their diminished role in surviving records of that period may be a function, first, of who produced those records, upper class males, and secondly, those who had survived. So because they weren't bound to the house the way the Greek women were, the Roman women seem not to have been content to play to play the mother and the homemaker, and so they gradually assumed a freer place in society. By the time of Augustus, women reclined on couches at dinner besides their husbands instead of sitting by their feet or on chairs. And as noted earlier, the Emperor Claudius, AD 41 to 54, enacted legislation allowing women to inherit property on their business and in their own names. And the owner of Roman's apartment house in the 2nd century was a woman. So not every one was comfortable with the freedom which women enjoyed by the mid 1st century AD. And again, stop and think that you have this mixture of these two groups of people, two different nationalities, as I guess we look at them, the Jews and the Greeks, the Hellenistic Jews, the Judaician, and all these became members of the church. And so they had all these different ways they were brought up. And so it would cause a problem in the congregation. To many, it appeared a license that there is no denying that Roman women conducted themselves as aggressively as women ever had in any era before our own. And the Roman men, once the emperors rendered them politically impotent, could only try to salvage a few scraps of power by urging women to be subject to their husbands. That the only way women and men became equals, according to what Marshall said. But that sentiment is common, as we said in the New Testament, yet with notes of mutability and the husband owning the wife's love and congenial rights, 1 Corinthians 7, 2 through 5, and many other passages, and they'll be listed in the notes. But I'm just going to say some things like under Roman law, women outside of Palestine could sue for a divorce. And we can see that in Mark chapter 10, verse 12, and also 1 Corinthians 7, verse 13. And we'll talk more about that in our lesson 8. But you have to realize that the Romans could get divorced, but according to the Deuteronomy law, Deuteronomy chapter 24, Jewish women could not divorce their husbands. So when you read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and he's actually dealing with that, about marriage and so forth, we need to keep in mind in reference to that. And not only that, but when people go and use Romans chapter 7, you need to realize that Paul there is talking to people who knew the Jewish law. And so he wasn't talking about Gentile people or Greek people, because they had different law. They were brought up under different laws in reference to that of marriage and divorce. But we'll talk more about that when we get to lesson 8. In Domitian's time, 81 to 96, it became the custom for men and women to bathe together in the public baths in Rome. And then some evidence suggests that this practice was copied in other cities, and we'll talk some more about that in lesson 8. But by 100 AD, women had cast off almost all the social conventions and were asserting their equality with that of men, taking part in court cases, according to the historians, and composing literary pieces. And unfortunately, they also rivaled men in less admirable ways, such as gorging themselves at banquets and engaging in athletic contests, even as gladiators in the arena. according to the historians. Though it should be pointed out that some scholars believe these last things were exaggerations by those people who were writing them, like, as we say, Pliny and Juvenal were writing these things, and they were just exaggerating, but they're in their writings. Then there was the daily activities that people would go through, the pattern by which a person would actually organize their daily life. And the way they do that, it really reveals to us their attitudes toward life and also their values. Our modern family was basically, it's probably still is in many ways, maybe the times changed because now we work places now, businesses have 12-hour shifts and just 2-hour shifts. You work 4 off 3, that type of thing. Some things have changed. And so schedule also implies that the hours before and after work are private. Many of people work 5 days a week. Some people work more than that, but anything being those hours is overtime above and beyond the call of duty and deserving extra pay. I read an article today, not an article, an advertisement today on Facebook down at Rockmart. They start people off $10 an hour. Every hour over 40 hours is time and a half. That's $15 an hour. If you have to work on Sunday, you get paid $20 an hour. So, that's pretty good. Say, for instance, if you work 10 hours a day, that's 50, and 10 hours on Saturday, that's 60. And so you got 60 hours in, that's 20 hours overtime, that's $300. You got $400. Then you work Sunday, and that you work 10 hours, that's $200. I didn't add all that up, so you can, but you're talking about $900 a week if you work that many hours. And I have done that myself, trying to support my family, preaching and trying to support my family. I've worked many long hours. And so, but it reflects our attitudes. We are always aware of time, seldom away from a clock or watch for a few minutes. We can't get cell phones out of our hands anymore. They got all kinds of stuff on them. We keep ourselves. I have my schedule on my cell phone. If I lose my cell phone, I don't know what I'd do. I guess I'd wait for somebody to say, hey, you're supposed to be over at my house tonight. And I said, about an hour ago, I had that happen to me one time. I was doing Bible studies, and I had about 10 Bible studies I had going, and I got one afternoon, I took me a bath and everything, put me on a pullover T-shirt, and a pair of blue jeans, a pair of tennis shoes, and I took off to do something other. And the fellow called me and says, hey, Bobby, where are you? I said, I'm on my way. And so I went right straight to where I was to have a Bible study. But we're all concerned about time. Now, the ancient people did not manipulate the day the way we do. They were more primitive or natural, I guess. Their schedule was the rising with the sun and the setting of the early afternoon when the day was the warmest. Then resuming activities in late afternoon before retiring fairly early at night. A pattern still familiar in some countries. And we see that, I can recall some of that with farmers. We used to go to school, and we didn't go to school except in August. And then we got out Labor Day, and a lot of people took off when the crops came in, take off for a week, school students did, so they could work in the fields. But David Dinge, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, concluded from his research that most people's experience a measurable lull in their level of alertness between 1 and 4 p.m. And I agree with that. I can lay down after 1 o'clock and sleep at 4 o'clock. So the Romans' daily schedule was structured to allow for a break at precisely that time. And so by the first century, this pattern of daily life was well established all around the Roman Empire, according to Marshall. And he describes those days. He says the first and second hour wear out clients greeting the patrons. The lawyers were getting hoarse by the third hour till the end of the fifth hour. Rome works at its various tasks. The sixth offers rest to the weary. The seventh will be the end. From the eighth to the ninth hour, the old wrestlers take the forge, and the ninth bids us to throw ourselves upon the beautiful, adorned couches. That's what he said. But I remember when I was preaching full time, and the economy got bad, and I had to go find a job, and I had a man who worked at UPS, and he got me a job at UPS. And I only worked anywhere from 3 to 5 hours a day. And that's what you work. They had shifts that way, 3 to 5 hours. You didn't work over 5 hours. If you worked 1 minute over 5 hours, they had to pay you for 8. And so that was the union rule. And so I got snowed in. And I worked a lot of hours, but I agreed that I would work I mean, I was going to have to be there, and that I'd just work on regular pay. I mean, because I was going to be there, I might as well work and get paid for it. But there are different ways things are done differently by different companies. But this all becomes clear when one reckons from about 6 a.m. as the first hour. Most lower class Romans had wealthy patrons on which they were expected to call at daybreak. And so when everybody in Rome got up to pay their respects and receive a small sum of money to help them through the day, this process was known. Among them, courts and other public offices were open early in the mornings, and any business not presented by the fifth hour around 11 o'clock had to be held for the next day. And so this pattern held true all the way across the empire. The New Revised Standard Version notes in Acts chapter 19, verse 9, reports for some manuscripts that Paul taught in Ephesus in the lecture hall of the certain Tyrannus from the fifth hour, that'd be 11 a.m. to the 10th hour, that'd be 4 p.m. And during the midday hours, after Tyrannus had finished his business for the day, people must have been interested enough in what Paul had to say to skip lunch and the siesta, as we would call it. Perhaps they drifted in and out during that time. But by noon, everyone was ready for lunch, and they were ready for a nap. A bit of exercise and the bath in the afternoons preceded dinner, which could began as early as 3. People expect either to entertain guests or to be invited out, but they didn't have fast food like we do. But it wasn't safe to be on the streets in Rome long after dark. About like going to Atlanta, I guess, long after dark. Dinner parties had to break up early, so they had to start rather early to get home. Even on holidays, whether regular or specifically decreed by the emperor, games and theater shows would fill the day. The daily schedule might have been different on a farm, because again, especially on planting and harvest time, like Matthew chapter 20 that we read a while ago. But urban life in the provinces would have differed only in a degree, according to Marshall's description of that. The workday began early. The afternoon and early evenings were reserved for relaxation, and everyone tried to be safe in their home shortly after dark. And that much was constant across that of the empire. The Jews may have eaten dinner a little later than the Romans, perhaps because they didn't have to worry about getting mugged or on the way home, or because their dinners weren't as elaborate. But the late dinner described in Acts 20, verses 7 and 8, now Mr. Bale here talks about that being a late dinner. But we understand that Acts 20, verse 7 and 8, that we're talking about the Lord's Supper. Brother Ferguson on page 140 deals with that. Would have struck most Greeks and Romans as out of the ordinary, even suspicious. And I think we did read where that they were suspicious of that because they didn't know what was going on in there, and therefore they understand that the bread had become the body of Christ, and the fruit of the vine became the blood of Christ. So therefore, these people were, worshiping some type of a god, and they were dedicated to do that by taking those emblems. Their meals, the evening meal, was the major event of the day in the Mediterranean world. And what I should have done, and I just thought about that, probably is to go on and see what a Mediterranean diet is today. There are people who go on the Mediterranean diet to lose weight, and I just wonder how that is today. But breakfast was usually a bit of bread and water, whatever happened to be left over from the evening meal. They had grain, wheat, and oats, and or barley for the poor, and was the staple of the ancient diet. Government policy often hinged on the necessity of securing an adequate supply. Lunch was also meager. In towns across the empire, there were taverns, small shops where people could get a bite to eat and a drink. And excavations, in the biblical archaeology, excavations have shown that there were often no room to sit in these places, so we can assume that people in the first century were familiar with the notion of fast food, because they didn't have a place to sit down. But by the late afternoon, the average person of the New Testament times was ready for a substantial meal. The Greeks had developed their evening meal. Isn't that amazing, though, when you read that? It makes me stop and think that we're always told we need to eat more at breakfast, less at dinner, and even less at supper, right? They had it backwards here. I don't see how they could work. I mean, I like to be full when I work. But the Greeks had developed their evening meal into an elegant party called a symposium, at which musicians entertained and the guests engaged in conversation on the topic chosen by the master of ceremonies. Now, the Romans refined the preparation and serving of such a meal to an art, and they made a significant social occasion of it. So securing an invitation to dinner was a prime objective of anyone with any social pretensions. Wealthy men invited their dinners large numbers of friends and clients and social parasites. Usually sent out invitations like the rich man did in Matthew 22. A few dinner invitations survived among the scraps of the papyrus documents discovered in years in Egypt. They were probably carried by servants and read to that of the guests. Other guests might be invited on an impulse during the day. Anyone able to do favors for the host or enjoy certain celebrity status was assured free meals. And so that was probably why Jesus was invited in Luke chapter 7, 36 through 50, at the home of Simon, the Pharisee. Brother Ferguson talks about that in page 517. But this process of wangling an invitation to dinner occupied a much of a lower class person's day. To judge from the number of poems that Marshall wrote, those who issued invitations wanted to show how important they were by the quality of the people who dined with them. They exceeded or expected dinner to be to lead to something else. They also expected their guests to reciprocate. Luke chapter 14, 12 through 14. And Marshall has unkind things to say about people who repeatedly find excuse for not fulfilling their obligations. So we have a detailed and a riotous, funny description of a dinner party at Petronius's dinner of Trimalchio, the major surviving portion of this Satyricon. After some exercise in the bath, the guests take their places on the couches in the dining room, had their hands washed and their toenails trimmed by slaves, and notice that they're at the table having their toenails done. And enjoy course after course of elaborate dishes, most of them prepared to impress after rather than to nourish the guests. It was expected that guests would eat everything that was put before them. If necessary, it was socially accepted to excuse oneself to go to the bathroom and induce vomiting to empty their stomachs, and they'd come back and enjoy the rest of the meal. So, they'd done things like that. And there is still an existence in the Roman recipe attributed to Apicius, which tells how to prepare the garum sauce that Romans gobbled on most of their meat dishes to cover the salty taste resulting from the way that people preserve food. And so the gourmet will also find recipes for stuffed sows, udders, and baked snails and other such delicacies. Y'all can have all of that for yourself. One noteworthy dish is white bread with crust trim, dipped in a mixture of eggs and milk, fried and covered with honey. Y'all know what that is, don't you? That's French toast. So a frequent complaint among that of the foods for dinner, though, is that distinctions were made among the guests in regard to the quality of food served. Sometimes those reclining near the host or at his table, if several tables were set up, were treated to eloquent dishes, while the less honored guests at the other tables were served second-rate fares. Much of Juvenal's filth satire is taken up in a complaint against the kinds of stingy patrons. That is, he said he soaks his fish in the best olive oil, and you get some pale cabbage reeking of stuff that would smell fine in a lantern. So like kerosene, I guess. Pliny explains that people sometimes made their distinctions as a sort of false economy, and he prefers to keep expenses down by serving some of the same sort a moderate menu to all of his guests, and such distinction among those at dinner may have been a part of the reason for this dissension among that of the Corinthians. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, people who know nothing of the ancient world think that they know that Roman dinners were drunken orgies. That popular notion is not entirely inaccurate, but even the potluck dinners at church in Corinth got a little bit rowdy, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 21. They actually, to the point where they turned the Lord's Supper into a common meal. And so the fact that most people perceive the Romans to have been engaged in such things regularly is another case of the most extreme examples of behavior. Most lower-class Romans never got within an ogling distance from an orgy, just as the average person in Los Angeles never gets invited to a wild Hollywood party. And so many of those upper class Romans, they abhorred such excesses, and so the dinner parties of the Emperor Titus were pleasant rather than elaborate. And his brother Domitian also took the approach. He gave dinners frequently and generously, but almost hurriedly. They never went on past sunset, nor did he hold drinking bouts afterwards. And so, in reply to a friend had written complaining that having an riotous dinner, Pliny essentially pointed out, he says, I certainly I don't give that kind of dinner. So he preferred a dinner with a simple, informal, abounding only in the Socratic conversation. But some Romans would consider Pliny a wet blanket because they found nothing wrong with what he would call an orgy. Our time is up. The next week is March the 14th, 2019, and we will start there. Any question or comment? Did I put y'all to sleep? Hope not. Save that.
No,
I heard you snore.
that was not me. That was Bubba.
All right, y'all have a good night. We'll see you, Lord.
Be careful driving home, Bobby.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Good night.